Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. All right. Sad to say this is our last video of the semester. Sad walk. Anyways, so let's get this party started. All right, so picking up from where we left off last time. We had first video of this week, mid-century rebellions in the Taiping Kingdom. The last video we talked about restoration and reform and some conflicts with the Western powers. And so in this video, we are talking about late dynastic reforms, 1898 to 1905. Get my face out. Whoa, nope, don't make me bigger. Get my face out of the way. There we go. Ta-da. All right. So let's talk about the rise of the 1898 reform movement. And so I'm going to kind of drag us back a little bit to talk about the late 19th century intellectual background that was happening in China. Now, what we're going to find with 1898 is a solid break, a solid expansion, a solid break in intellectual events and life. Because in previous attempts in the Tongji Restoration, for example, they were trying to sort of figure out a way to keep the cultural essence while bringing in some aspects of reform. This is sort of a way, what we're finding in 1898 is we're starting to see this idea that maybe the old dynasty, the old forms aren't redeemable. And so we have intellectual thought sort of seeping into China in the 19th century. We have the barbarian affairs experts. These are the people who worked with the Zhongli men, trying to sort of be the experts of the West, trying to figure out, okay, this is what we know about them, this is how we deal with them, sort of thing. That's one way that Western intellectual thought sort of seeped in, sort of found its way into China. Second way we've talked about a little bit, Western missionaries. We've seen it with Hong Quan, we've seen it with Christian converts and the like. And then the third way tends to be what we're known as treaty port intellectuals. These are members of the literati, members of the intellectual classes in treaty ports such as Shanghai. And these areas tended to be closer intellectually to Paris, to London, to New York than it was intellectually to Beijing. Maybe physically closer, but intellectually much more in tune with London or Paris or New York. And so groups such as the barbarian affairs experts, groups such as these treaty port intellectuals, start advocating for more Western style reform. Now, one man I want to talk about is Kang Yu-wei. There we are. Kang Yu-wei, K-A-N-G-U-Y-O-U, Wei, W-E-I. Kang Yu-wei, there we go, becomes an important transitional figure in modern Chinese history. He's going to draw on Confucian thought, and his influence will continue on and influence the teachings of Mao Zedong. And so his emphasis, he looks back at Confucian thought and he sees three aspects. He sees ritual, he sees filial piety, and he sees benevolence. And he goes, okay, we've been so focused on ritual, or we've been ritual obligations. We've been so focused on filial piety. Maybe we need a government, maybe we need a way that focuses on benevolence. Now, Kang Yu-wei, born in 1858, born into a family of scholar officials. In fact, he was born down in Canton, so his origins, southern China, very much in the region influenced by Western thought. And as he grew up, he developed a moral mission to save his fellow man from whatever problems he may be experiencing. Now, there are two major components to his teachings. The first component is a long range component. And in the long term, in the long range, he envisioned a Chinese state that was very utopic, a utopia that was characterized by harmony and bliss. But you can't really reach that long-term goal if you don't really have a state to apply it to. So his immediate component to his teachings was to try to set up a pragmatic, a progressive, a political program designed to save China from dismemberment. So he looks at what's happening with the scramble for concessions, and he sees China just being carved up like a suckling pig. So Kong Yu-wei's immediate focus was a pragmatic political solution to save China from this dismemberment. And so he starts pushing his ideas 1896, 1897. And similar to the Tongji Restoration, Kong Yu-wei's programs were modeled on the Meiji Restoration in Japan, as well as Peter the Great's industrialization of Russia. Now, Russia is important because just like China, Russia had a large large peasant population. So Peter the Great's industrialization program served as a role model for how China could introduce industrialization while having a large peasant population. So Kong Yu-wei made some arguments. He argued for institutional reforms. In fact, he sort of looked at what Japan did with the Meiji Constitution and said, okay, why don't we do something similar? Now, Japan set it up so that their emperor still had significant power. But Kong Yu-wei argued, let's reorganize government structured on this idea of a constitutional monarchy. Because areas such as Britain are shifting in that direction, whereas others, Germany, Japan, are shifting to more consolidation of power in the hands of the emperor, the Kaiser, or whoever. We've been trying this consolidation, so let's now try this idea of a constitutional monarchy. And he also pushed for cultural education reform of the culture and how people understood their culture, and now they're educated about it. And one of the things he advocated was for the abolishment of the examination system. Now, think of it. You're taking away, on the one hand, you're taking away the potential for social movement, going from one class to another. But on the other hand, you're having this civil service system where if you do well, you can expand not only your life but the lives of others, not just in government but elsewhere. So Kong Yu-wei sort of sets up what we're going to find in 1898. And so between mid-June and mid-September 1898, you sort of have the rise of reform, the rise of late dynastic reforms. And so study societies or student societies where they come together and discuss the aspects of the day, the news of the day, as well as for the first time, modern Chinese newspapers, not focused on getting out the information from the state, but rather as a fifth estate to comment and criticize the government. Earlier in 1898, we have another gentleman, Tan Sitong. I think I have his name. There we go. Tan Sitong. As you can tell, 1898 is not going to be a good year for him. He was one of these treaty port intellectuals. He argued this in public that the old order, the dynasty, was irredeemable. There were no redeeming aspects of the dynasty, and therefore it should be abolished. He argued the revolution was not a necessary evil. It was not, oh, we have to do this, but rather it is fundamental in human experience. In fact, he would argue it was the ultimate human experience. Tan Sitong saw people as progressive, as always trying to move forward. And change is inevitable, and revolution is inevitable, and indeed the ultimate human experience. That didn't go over too well. And so in 1898, he was executed and became a martyr for the reform movement. And so, again, mid-June to mid-September 1898, we have the martyrdom of Tan Sitong. We have study societies and newspapers starting to percolate these ideas. Kong Yu is a member in the imperial court. He's a member in the government. And the Guangzhou emperor, the emperor that took over in 1875, starts to take heed, starts to take notice of some of Kong Yu's ideas. And it's interesting because by this point, 1898, 13, he would have been 17. So he's starting to just hit his age of majority. So some argued that the Guangzhou emperor starts taking ideas of reform as a means to sort of push his power up while lowering the power of the Empress Dowager. While others argued that the Guangzhou emperor had a genuine support for reform. But whichever way it is, whether he's a genuine supporter of reform or if he wanted to sort of diminish the Empress Dowager's power, the Guangzhou emperor issues an edict in June 1898 declaring that reform is now the national policy. And further reform edicts announced between June and September are announced, with Kong Yu and his supporters being brought into the imperial court as advisors for the Guangzhou emperor. Now remember, Kong Yu wants the government structured on a constitutional monarchy, and he wants to abolish the examination system. He's attacking fundamental pillars of Chinese society. So not everybody is happy. Not everybody is thrilled with these attacks on reform. The Guangzhou emperor actually alienates all the vested interests, the gentry, the scholars in China, as well as the military, and the Empress Dowager will actually launch a successful coup d'etat, COUP space D apostrophe ETAT, with the military. But that's not the end of reform. Reform continues on even after the Empress Dowager takes a more active role. And so there are three aspects. So that's why, even though it's the 1898 reform movement, we're looking at a 7-year period up to 1905. There's three aspects of reform. There's military reform, that kind of a continuation of reform under the Tongji reforms, Tongji Restoration. There's educational reform, and then there's institutional reform. Now, even though the Empress Dowager sort of retakes power in 1898, we're going to see aspects of what was tried in 1898. So military. We have, again, a growing push towards military industrialization. New, somewhat more national armies. We still have a large amount of regionalization in China, but we have new style armies that are organized, that are trained by German officers, Western officers, and supplied with Western weapons. And we also have a shift in a public attitude towards the military. Prior to these reforms in the 19th century, the military, the army, was seen as a place for the dregs of society to go. But now with growing reform and growing prestige in the military, it's seen as an avenue for the elite to legitimately go. We have educational reform. So Kong Yue, even though his influence is diminished after the Empress Dowager comes into her own, his push to abolish the exam system continued. And indeed, in 1905, the examination system is officially abolished, and we have educational reform patterned on Western style of education. We have Western subjects like science and math, rather than just focusing on the Confucian on classical philosophy. Women were also introduced to the educational system. Women were admitted to schools in 1907. But limited federal funding meant there was limited educational reform. Because the elite, the people with money, did not want to put their money into the state towards a educational system that they're likely not going to use, because they continue to send their children abroad to Western schools to study. Oxford, Cambridge, as we have more access, as China has more access to the United States, Stanford, Harvard, other American schools. So Chinese children of the elite are being sent to those schools. So why they feel should they spend their money on educational system that I won't benefit from? Which meant that the new educational system would be more expensive. Students would have to pay for tuition, board, rooming, feeding themselves, new materials, etc., which would limit a already small pool of potential people who could afford to go to school in the first place. And then we have institutional reform. And this is, I'm always troubled why the Empress Dowager decided to engage in a coup d'etat if she's going to engage in a lot of the same things that the Guangzhou emperor was going to do. Because institutionally, she shifts to a constitutional monarchy model. Power is still held within the dynasty because members of the dynasty are appointed certain positions, even though the emperor is a constitutional monarch. And in this case, they based it along with the Meiji Restoration. They based it on the Japanese model of modernization. So more power, even though it's constitutional monarchy, similar to Japan and the Ottomans, power resides, a fair amount of it would reside in the emperor. These institutional reforms provide a limited form of democracy at the provincial level, but they limit the franchise, they limit the voting rights at the provincial level. So, what is the significance of this reform movement? Well, it demonstrates the elasticity. I almost had it. Elasticity. There we go. Of the Confucian tradition, the malleability, the adaptability of the Confucian tradition, and indeed the Chinese cultural essence. The 1898 reform movement marks the shift from reform, that is, change from within, towards more revolution. Because it's after 1898 that we start to see the appearance of bona fide national revolutionaries. And so we see a polarization towards revolution and reform, but only throughout the cities and only amongst the elite. Because the peasants are just trying to continue to work their land, trying to make ends meet, trying to do what they can do to live. But the 1898 reform movement is the last decade that was really vigorous in reform. And so after she takes power in 1898, the Empress Dowager, as we see, starts suggesting more and more radical reforms to start to save the nation. It's important to know the terminology. She emphasizes that these reforms are to save the nation, not the dynasty. She starts to understand that the dynasty may falter, but the nation endures. So she starts setting up a Bureau of Governmental Reform, which helps push this idea of a constitutional monarchy. She starts pushing more pro-Western ideas. And indeed, between 1898 and 1905, we sort of have a sense of optimism with respect to reform. Like, we might be able to reform enough to save the nation. But the overall effects of reform, well, the reform at its end failed. And the reforms failed because of the halfway attempts to reform. It's like, okay, we'll go part of the way rather than all of the way. We have a start, okay, the Guangzhou emperor is starting to listen to some of these ideas, but then we'll have a coup d'etat, and then we'll try these ideas again in a couple of years. And what it did is it undermined the dynasty rather than bulwarked, rather than helped it succeed. The new armies with the military reform. The new armies were more loyal to the nation than the dynasty. Indeed, it would be the officers in these new militaries that would help lead the overthrow of the dynasty and set up provincial regions as their own warlords. You start having the importation of more radical Western ideas through students who are studying abroad, students whose parents are members of the elite who maybe want the who maybe tend to be more conservatives. And students are going to provide the agitation towards revolution. Indeed, it's going to be the abolishment of the examination system, which would lead some to question even the need for the dynasty. And as provinces start trying to reform themselves to better support the dynasty rejects these ideas at the provincial level of shaping and creating policy, which would lead to the alienation of the provincial elite, the provincial gentry that the dynasty needs to succeed. Which brings us to the revolutionary movement. And so I'm going to talk about this man here, Sun Yat-sen, Sun Yat-sen, 1866 to 1925. Sun Yat-sen, seen here on the left. Sun Yat-sen, that's his Chinese name, helped usher in a new political movement in the Chinese landscape. Sun Yat-sen, known as the father of the Chinese Republic, and his primary appeal to the people, elite and non-elite, was primarily anti-Manchu, anti-dynasty. And in 1905, he helped develop the Revolutionary Alliance. Originally a number of small different organizations, he helped coalesce it into the Nationalist Party. Now there's two ways. There we are. There's two ways of spelling or pronouncing the Nationalist Party. We have the Guomindang, Guomindang, but the one you're more likely to see is a Kuomintang, Quomintang. That is the Nationalist Party in China. He was Western. He had a Western education. There we go. And indeed, I mean, he could be seen as China's first modern revolutionary. Sun Yat-sen was born to a Hakka family in the Guangdong province, the birthplace of the Taiping Rebellion, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And so he was raised on stories of the Taiping Rebellion. Sun Yat-sen believed that the whole political edifice, the whole political system was rotten enough that all it needed was just a little shove to tip it over. And to help do so, he established the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. And this was an attempt to gain support from the educated classes. Collectively, the three principles of the people, also known as the San Min Doctrine, SAN-MIN Doctrine. Nationalism, what he means by this is freedom from imperialist domination. In other words, he wanted a China controlled by the Chinese. No British, no Germans, no Russians, no Korea, that's kind of off, no French. He wanted a China for the Chinese. Freedom from imperialist domination. He argued for democracy. He wanted a Western-style constitutional government with the power residing in the people to express their political wishes. The idea of electing officials, the idea of recall, if an official does something that is against the will of the people, they have the power to recall that official from government and have a new election for that position. Initiative. Uh, the people could put forth propositions, and these propositions would be voted on. And referendum, again, this idea where major decisions would have or could be voted on. So he wanted more of a Western style democracy. He wanted nationalism in China for the Chinese. And then we have this idea of people's livelihood. This here is more of an idea of social welfare or a social safety net. The government providing food, clothing, housing, transportation for the people, the things that people need to live. Now, Sun Yat-sen, just one moment. I just need to fix one last thing. All right, sorry about that. I just wanted to fix one last thing. Whoop, you can't see me. Let's try that again, Mark. There we go. Go back to Sun Yat-sen. Boop. All right, so we talked about nationalism, we talked about democracy, we talked about people's livelihood, making up the Sanmin Doctrine. Now, Sun Yat-sen argued that there were three stages of revolution. There's military rule, so basically a military revolution. That's relatively straightforward. Next, we have what he referred to as tutelage, sort of a guided democracy, where a political elite would sort of guide the people towards a democratic government. And then the third stage of revolution would be constitutional democracy. And for his revolutionary ideas, he would present the best front he could, or limit what he would present based on his audience. So if he's talking to members of the gentry, he would sort of not really talk that much or be ambivalent about land reform and taking land away from people to give it to more people. But if he's talking to a group of peasants, he's going to talk about land reform, saying we got to take these large areas of land and give it to the people. And so the basis for Sun Yat-sen's appeal was his sense of optimism, his sense of inevitability, his belief in the imminence, the immediacy of the revolution, and his belief in the fact that the revolution would succeed. It also kind of helped that he had access to money and manpower, but his ideas began to permeate and build support. 1905, 1906, 1907, 1908, leading into, and I'm going to go back here, the 1911 revolution. And so between 1905 and 1911, we have a building of support for revolution. By 1908, early 1909, it became apparent to moderates, especially the moderate gentry, that the political reform undertaken by the Empress Dowager was a means to concentrate rather than diffuse power. It was a means to concentrate power in the hands of the dynasty more so than to spread it out to other people. And so revolutionary propaganda, 1908, 1909, 1910, starts becoming widely circulated, particularly through the army. And so in 1911, we have what's called the Wu Chang Uprising in 1911. It started out with an uprising of a small number of army officers. But these army officers had the advantage of having control over provincial arsenals and provincial treasuries. And so over time, this uprising started to spread from province to province to province as support throughout the various provinces start building for uprising, start building for uprisings. And so the gentry and provisional assemblies in the provinces start to meet. And so by late 1911, I'll go to a map here. All the provinces, all the provinces, except for 5 in the north, decide to break away from the Qing dynasty. All of these provinces were supported by local military units and the local provincial capitals, the district magistrates, the gentry. And so by the next year, 1912, the provincial assembly sends delegates to Nanjing. They declare the Chinese Republic and elect Sun Yat-sen as its first president. It will take some time after the 1911 revolution for Sun Yat-sen and then his successor Chiang Kai-shek to start consolidating their power, to start rebuilding a republic from these disparate provinces. But by the 1920s, 1930s, they are able to do so before they are met with a new challenge, the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. And I'm going to end our time there. So thank you guys very much for joining me on this voyage of discovery. I hope that you guys enjoyed everything. If you are a glutton for punishment, in fall 2021, I'm teaching History 150, which is my terrorism in the 19th and 20th century class, as well as 116. You can't really take it twice. And I'm also doing History 307, which is social history of the 60s in North America. All right, so I'm going to end it there. So for the very last time, go forth, slay dragons. All right, talk to you later. Bye.